Hello friends, our today's topic is nationalist discourse. Let's begin our discussion with the terms state, nation and nationalism. You all are familiar with these terms. In simple words, the first term, state, denotes a geographical area, a defined territory having a permanent population, some form of government and sovereignty to enter into diplomatic relations with other states. A group of people can be referred to be a nation when they share a national identity that is based on a combination of shared social characteristics such as culture, ethnicity, religion and often language, tradition, geographical location and belief in a shared unique history. Nationalism therefore seeks to protect and promote a nation's traditional culture. It is important to note here that nationalism is an ideology that emphasizes loyalty, devotion or allegiance to a nation or nation state and holds that such obligations outweigh other individual or group interests including race, culture and religion. Nationalism developed at the end of the 18th century, particularly with French Revolution. According to modernization theory, nationalism emerged due to processes of modernization such as industrialization, urbanization and mass education. These processes have helped to generate national consciousness and to imagined communities where collective identity binds individuals together in political solidarity. The moral value of nationalism, the relationship between nationalism and patriotism and the association and compatibility of nationalism with cosmopolitanism has many dimensions. The positive or negative sides of nationalism depends on the ideology and outcomes. On the one hand, it has accelerated national movements for freedom and justice, cultural revivalism and national pride. On the other, it has also been used to legitimize racial, ethnic and religious divisions, suppress or attack minorities and undermine human rights and democratic traditions. History of the last 2 centuries of almost all the countries across the world depicts this phenomenon. Now we come to another aspect, what is Indian nationalism. There are many views about perspectives on Indian nationalism. Broadly, we can discuss them as the colonialist, nationalist and Marxist perspectives on Indian nationalism. To begin with, we will discuss colonialistic perspective. Early historians of the 19th century who examined Indian history included British and other academicians. Their view appeared in James Mill's book In History of India and then many English historians including Montesquieu, Elphinstone, Henry Eliot and John Dawson, W. Hunter and Vincent Smith provided detailed interpretation of the Indian perspective about nationalism. They interpret Indian history. They rejected the idea of India as a nation. They always emphasized diversity and disunity in India to justify the colonial rule which was considered to have united it. Right since the early days of colonial rule, India was depicted as a land of hostile and warring units. Hunter, Herbert Risley and many others empathetically attempted to prove it by segregating and classifying the country into innumerable tribes and castes. When the Indian national movement began emerging in the late 19th century and matured during the 20th century, famous British historians such as John Strachey and John Seeley asserted that it was impossible to forge a nation in India because it has never had the characteristics of a nation, nor it could ever have it in future. According to them, India was a cluster of different and often antagonistic religious, ethnic, linguistic and regional groups which could never be welded into a nation. With the rise of nationalist movement and the nationalist ideas about existence of Indian nation, it became even more necessary for the colonialist ideologies and historians to counter it. The strongest statement in this regard was provided by Valentine Chirol, who in 1910 in his book Indian Unrest asserted that India was a mere geographical expression and even this geography was forged by the British. In his view, India was a variegated jumble of races and peoples, castes and creeds, which could never evolve into a nation and which is an antithesis to all that the word national implies. In effect, India was inhabited by a great variety of nations. There are far more distinct languages spoken in India than in Europe, and there are far more profound racial differences between the Marathas and Bengalis than between German and Portuguese. This was only the British rule that prevents these ancient divisions from breaking out once more into open and sanguinary strife. Thus, for him, the term India was no more than a geographical creation by the British for administrative purposes. Similarly, Vincent Smith held the view that there was a basic lack of unity among Indians. He termed the relationship among different political entities or states in India as mutually repellent molecules. The lack of cohesion among states, which always remain easy prey to invaders such as Greeks, Arabs, Turks, Iranians, Afghans, and many others. This situation was corrected when central authority was imposed from outside as by the British. According to colonialist historians, hence, there was no possibility of a movement that could be called national. Even when the national movement became a par-Indian reality as a mass movement after First World War, colonialist historians questioned its effectiveness and tried to highlight the religious, caste and linguistic divisions to deny its national character. Now we come to another perspective, that is nationalist perspective. Nationalist perspective on Indian nationalism was developed in response to colonial view. Though nationalist writers accepted some of the ideas of nationalists' writings, they strongly rejected their claim to deny India as a nation. The nationalist historians adopted an idea-centric approach. Upadhyay in his writings on Indian nationalism says that there are primarily two views among them. According to some writers, nationalist ideas have been adopted under the influence of the West, while others argue that they have been present since ancient times. In the early phase of Indian national movement, the modern nationalists generally thought that this spirit of freedom arose primarily due to the Western influences. According to these writers, Western education and ideas of liberty were responsible for the formation of national consciousness. Later, when the national movement intensified, writers began searching for the indigenous roots to such ideas. According to the first view, nationalist consciousness was formed among the English educated middle classes with their desire for liberty and freedom. This strengthened their patriotic feelings. The Indian National Congress was the result of the search to find an avenue for self-expression and self-assertion. The intense feeling of loss of freedom and domination by outsiders was expressed in numerous revolts since the establishment of British rule, culminating in the Great Revolt of 1857. After that, it sought new channels to express itself. Nationalist writers saw the later, that is, extremist phase of the national movement as a result of better ideas, a greater spirit of freedom, sturdier patriotism, and a greater will and capacity to undergo suffering and make sacrifices. Many Indian nationalists and nationalist historians like Surendranath Banerjee did not consider India as a formed nation in modern times, but as a nation in the making. R.C. Majumdar and others felt that, based on common grievances, the national movement united Indians from various regions and different walks of life. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were Bengalis, Hindustanis, Marathas, Sikhs, etc., but no Indian. The conception of the motherland of the Indian nation was a recent phenomenon. Interestingly, an equally strong trend claimed that India had been a nation since the earliest times. Radha Kumud Mukherjee, in his book Fundamental of India, Harbilas Sharda, in his book Hindu Superiority, Lajpat Rai and many others, asserted that India has been a nation for the last 2000 years. K.P. Jaiswal, in his book Hindu Polity in 1924, said that India possessed everything which modern Britain could claim: big empires, enduring and successful republics, representative elective institutions, strong parliaments, a constitutional monarchy, and supremacy of law above the executive authority. Emphasizing another dimension, Rabindranath Tagore expressed that India was not simply a territorial unit, but possessed a much broader civilizational and cultural unity. Various invaders came and became assimilated into its ethos, enriching its culture. It is this inclusive and assimilative spirit that characterizes India's national identity and differentiated it from European nationalism. Similarly, Gandhi, Subhash Chandra Bose, Jawaharlal Nehru and many others claimed that India possesses fundamental and cultural unity despite endless diversity. The nationalist historians, besides the spirit of freedom, also mentioned that various factors which helped in rise of national movement include an unfriendly attitude of colonial rulers, their feeling of superiority, racial feeling, modern education, the printing press, modern literature, and finally the partition of Bengal. Besides these, some economic factors led to a feeling of dissatisfaction among Indians. The exploitations of peasants, high land revenue, forced cultivation of indigo and some other cash crops, the drain of wealth, wasteful expenditure of Indian revenue to maintain large military force to be used against Indians or for fighting wars that did not concern India and many others. The national historians pointed out the underlying contradictions in terms of caste, class, religion, language and region, and also portray a pan-Indian anti-imperialistic feeling above these contradictions as a binding force for the national movement. They also held the view that the masses in general were not capable of independent action and were to be mobilized by middle class leaders. Surendranath Banerjee wrote in 1911 that wherever you have a middle class, you have enlightenment, freedom, progress and prosperity. Lajpat Rai commented that the masses are easily led astray by government or by classes in league with governments. In every country, it is the educated middle class that leads the movement for political independence or political progress. The national leaders in India were dedicated idealists. They were inspired by patriotism and the welfare of the country. Despite coming from the middle classes, these national leaders possessed no personal or group or class interests. They were selfless spokespersons of the silent majority and represented all classes and communities to pursue national, secular and progressive politics. The third perspective on nationalism is Marxist perspective. Marxist historians have adopted a totally different perspective on Indian nationalism from that of colonialist and nationalist perspectives. On the one hand, they criticize colonialists for holding a discriminatory view of India and its people and criticize nationalists for seeking roots of nationalism in the ancient past on the other. They criticize both for not giving attention to economic factors and class differentiation in their analysis. The Marxist approach is based on the analysis of mode of production and classes. Marxian historians held the view that there was a basic contradiction between imperialism and Indian society, and there is also a class contradiction within Indian society. They try to explain these processes in the context of the economic changes under colonialism. The underlying thinking of these historians was that India was not always a nation, but the creation of modern times, and the nationalist movement had played an important role in it. M.N. Roy, who was one of the leading personalities in the national and international communist movement in the 1920s, explained the development of the Indian nationalist movement within a universalist framework with the development of international capitalism. In his opinion, the dominant classes in India were not feudal lords but the bourgeois, explaining the fundamental difference between India and the Western system. Roy held that in feudal dominant societies, the emerging national bourgeoisie is often revolutionary. But in India, where feudalism did not develop as in Europe, the bourgeoisie had turned conservative and wanted to preserve the existing order. In this situation, only the workers would be revolutionary. Roy also believed that the political ideology of native capitalism was developed in the late 19th and earlier 20th century with imperialism around the First World War, which was also the period of rise of Indian National Congress. Thus, for Roy, the Indian national movement was representing the political ideology and the aspiration of a youthful bourgeoisie. R.P. Dutt, in his famous book India Today in 1947, also presented a Marxist interpretation of Indian nationalism. According to him, the revolt of 1857 was the revolt of the old conservative and feudal forces and dethroned rulers or monarchs. Dutt traced the beginning of the Indian national movement from the last quarter of the 19th century. According to him, the previous activities of the Indian middle classes formed the background, and the Indian National Congress, established in 1885, gradually became the main organization of this movement. That by applying Marxist class analysis, that argues that the class base of the Congress and the national movement changed over the period. Initially, only the big bourgeois, the progressive elements among the landowners, the new industrial bourgeois, and the well-to-do intellectual elements were concerned about the nationalism. Before the First World War, the urban petty bourgeois class was the influential. But in the later period, the Indian masses, peasantry and industrial working classes emerged as an influential force and made their presence left. However, as Dutt says, the leadership remained in the hands of the influential property classes in Congress. This prevented any radicalization of the movement, which could become dangerous to their own interests. The withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement and civil disobedience movement was also the result of this fear of converting these into militant movements. In his book Social Background of Indian Nationalism in 1948, A.R. Desai holds that the national movement in India has developed through 5 phases. Each phase is characterized by a prominent class influential during that period. In the first phase, a national movement was initiated and supported by the intelligentsia, who were the product of the modern English system of education. This phase began with Ram Mohan Roy and his followers and continued till 1885. The second phase started with the formation of Indian National Congress and continued till 1905, when the Swadeshi movement emerged. In this phase, modern education created a middle class. With the development of national and international trade and modern industries, a new merchant class and a class of industrialists started to grow. In other words, this new phase of the national movement included the demands of the educated classes, the trading bourgeois, the stoppage of the economic drain, and some of the resolutions of the Indian National Congress. The third phase of the national movement started with the Swadeshi movement and continued till 1918. In this phase, the national movement covered a broader social base which included different sections of the lower middle classes. The fourth phase covered the period from Rowlatt Satyagraha to 1919 to the end of the civil disobedience movement in 1934. This movement, which was until now confined mainly to the upper and the middle classes, now began to encompass the entire section of the masses. However, Desai observed that the leadership of the Congress remained in the hands of those who were under the influence of the Indian capitalist class. From 1918 onwards, the industrial bourgeoisie had a powerful influence in determining the program, policies, strategies and forms of struggle of the Indian national movement. There were two more significant developments in this period. One, the rise of the left group since late 1920s, which introduced pro-people agenda in the national movement, and two, the consolidation of communal forces which sought to divide the society. In the fifth phase, that is 1934 to 1939, there was a growing disenchantment with the Gandhian ideology within the Congress. A section of them rose as a socialist congressman who represented the petty bourgeois elements. Outside the Congress, the movement of peasants, workers, depressed classes and various linguistic nationalities had developed. Divisive ideology of communalism had also grown in influence. However, despite this, the mainstream was still solidly occupied by the Gandhian Congress. With time, many Marxist historians began to differ from these views. Bipin Chandra analyzed the economic thinking of early nationalist leaders and concluded that their outlook was basically capitalist, not because they were supporting the individual interest of the capitalists, but because they believed that industrial development along capital lines was the only way to regenerate the country in the economic field. In other words, the interest of the industrial capitalist class objectively coincide with the chief national interest of that time. Bipin Chandra has supported some ideas of Datan Desai. For example, the understanding of non-violence. He interprets the peaceful and bloodless approach of a struggle adopted by the national leaders as a basic guarantee to the propertied classes that they would not at any time be faced with any threat to their interests. Similarly, they all felt that the relationship between the Indian masses and the nationalists always remained problematic. For the moderate leaders, the masses had no role to play and the extremists failed to mobilize the masses. Although the masses came into the nationalist fold during the Gandhian period, they were not politicized and the lower classes of agricultural workers and poor peasants in most part of the country were never politically mobilized. Even when they were mobilized, the masses remained outside the decision-making process. Political activity of the masses was always controlled from the top. They never became an independent political force. Thirdly, the nationalist leaders always stressed that the process of achieving national freedom would be evolutionary and not revolutionary. They followed the tactics of pressure, compromise, pressure. They brought pressure upon colonial rulers through agitations, political work and mobilization of people. When the authorities offer concessions, the pressure would be withdrawn and a compromise would be reached. After accepting political concessions, leaders start preparing for another agitation for new concessions. Thus, this ultimately led to the freedom of the country. Viewing the whole national movement, Bipin Chandra explained it as the only movement where the state power was not seized in a single historical movement of revolution, but through the prolonged popular struggle on a moral, political and ideological level. The struggle was not violent because the nationalist leaders were concerned with fighting against imperialism as well as welding India into a nation. The struggle was fought at both intellectual and political levels and proved that colonial rule was not invincible. The reinterpretation of Gandhian nonviolence now accepts that it was neither a mere dogma nor worked to protect the interest of only propertied classes. It was a mass movement that mobilized people to the widest possible extent. It was in fact an all-class national movement. To sum up, it can be said that all these three perspectives view the Indian national movement from different angles. Colonialists disagreed the possibility of India ever becoming a nation. Moreover, they saw this movement as a movement of narrow self-interest led by a microscopic English-educated minority. The nationalists, on the other hand, claimed that India always has the most potential to be seen as a nation, though they did not deny the role of modern Western ideas and education. They also emphasized the underlying cultural unity since most ancient times. Marxist historians analyzed the role of economic factors and classes in the making of the nation and the movement. According to them, this movement was either directly influenced by the bourgeoisie or indirectly worked as in the direction of capitalist development. Thus, even though various classes and groups were involved in the movement, it ultimately served the interest of the Indian bourgeois classes.